Western Arctic.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And after a number of years, I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak to this new Bill C-22, an act which, of course, sets the terms and conditions of liability not only for nuclear issues, but also for oil and gas issues. And it's a little bit misleading in the title, and it speaks only to offshore, and I'll point that out a little later on, that it's not exactly right, that title. So I think I'll deal with, first of all, the principle that we're operating here is that second reading we deal with principles. This is where we talk about the principles of the bill. The principle, which I think we can all support, is that the liability for nuclear accidents, for oil and gas spills, should lie in a decent fashion with those that make those things happen. So what we have is a bill which we can accept that the principle moving forward is okay. Many of the details still remain as they were 6 years ago, understated. You know, 6 years ago we talked about a $650 million liability limit on nuclear plants. Now we're talking about $1 billion. It's not, what's happened in the intervening time? Well, we've seen Fukushima. So we know quite clearly that nuclear liability is at a higher level than we ever dreamed, that we ever thought possible in a modern state such as Japan, with the equipment that we assumed that this equipment would have been handled in a decent fashion. But what we found out is that right from the very beginning, the opportunity for failure had been built into the system. So liability is important. It's important right from day one. When people understand the nature of their liability, they're not going to shortchange on the construction of facilities. They're not going to start out bean counting how much it is that they have to invest in a particular facility in order to avoid the types of liabilities that unlimited liability would apply to it. So when we reduce liability, we probably end up with a lesser product to service our nuclear industry or our offshore oil and gas industry. That I think is quite clear in modern the modern economics of today. Most companies employ scores of accountants examining the liability of their actions. So when we set liability limits, those are going to determine the degree to which the companies ensure that the safety of their projects is well maintained. So is $1 billion enough for the nuclear industry to ensure that the nuclear operator is going to put the best possible effort into creating a nuclear plant, the best possible effort into running an existing plant, the best possible effort into ensuring that when the types of conditions, such as Fukushima, where you had this situation where quite easily the backup power supply could be flooded, that someone does a careful safety analysis of the existing facilities. So liability limits are important. They're extremely important because they set the parameter for the industry. And I think as we go along in this debate and we see what at committee, we see what the kind of presentations are, the new presentations after Fukushima are about nuclear liability. I think it will become very clear to us that $1 billion is probably not enough. Now I'm going to leave that subject and I'm going to move over to the liability regimes for offshore oil and gas spills. Well, interestingly enough, we speak of offshore, but here within the Appendix 1, we talk about onshore in the Northwest Territories and Nunavut. And if you're onshore within 200 meters from inland water, under the current liability limits, there's no limit specified. Now we're going to put it at 25 million. So what's happened recently in the Northwest Territories? Well, between Wrigley and Norman Wells, we had a spill of oil in a buried pipeline that has cost easily that amount of money to clean up. Easily that amount of money to clean up, and we still haven't dealt with it completely. We've got aging pipelines throughout this country, as well as in the Northwest Territories. We've got facilities that need attention. So what do we do when we set a $25 million liability limit on an oil pipeline that's been there for 30 or 40 years? How does that work out when one company sells it to another, when we deal with the nature of the oil and gas industry? Who's taking care of it? To what degree do they see the liability as being the most important part of what they're doing? So $25 million to me in the Northwest Territories on land doesn't sound like a lot of money to take care of the kind of spills that can occur from buried oil pipelines traversing the territory. And when it comes to blowouts in the high Arctic, we've actually had one. In the late 70s, in the Arctic archipelago, we had a major blowout. Luckily, it was natural gas. The flare from that natural gas blowout was visible by aviation. They used it as a navigation medium in the high Arctic because it was so large, and it went on for 9 or 10 months. You can imagine what would happen with that type of spill if that had been an oil well, if that had been an oil discovery that had blown out on them. So within the limited number of wells that have been drilled in the Arctic, we've already had a blowout. That's the reality of it, folks. So now we're talking about a liability limit offshore of $1 billion. We saw with the spill in the Gulf of Mexico, tens of billions of dollars were involved in the cleanup of that spill. So how do we quantify that in the Arctic? Well, the National Energy Board did a study on it, and they determined that we don't really know how to deal with it, but what we're going to do is just approve projects as they come by, and we'll see what the companies are offering in terms of how they're going to deal with blowout situations or other types of spills. And interestingly enough, there is a clause in here. So with proof of fault or negligence, there's unlimited liability in most of these cases. So what we've done here is we've separated between $1 billion, if it wasn't your fault, it just happened to blow out, and okay, that's what it costs. If it was your fault, then of course you're going to pay. Now, how does that work when a National Energy Board approves a project that they know they don't have any solution for a blowout? Where does that liability land then? How does that work in the situation in the Arctic? These are questions that need examination. This is why we should talk about these things in Parliament. This is why I'm standing up here today, taking the time that I have, 10 minutes. Does that cover the full knowledge that we have about these situations? Does that answer any questions? Not really. That's not much. No, we're going to need some serious time in committee to do anything with this particular bill to understand what the liability. And interestingly enough, we're setting liability limits on land in the Northwest Territories. Well, what did we just go through in Parliament here just a little while ago? A devolution agreement where Governor of Northwest Territories now is responsible for a lot of this stuff on the land. How's that going to work? Has the Governor of Northwest Territories given its okay to this liability limit on the land that it has responsibility for now? So those are questions that we need answered. These are things that obviously are going to take a long time in committee. We've been through this before. 6 years ago, 7 years ago, we started this. Yes? Many bills have been brought forward under that time. Government's thrown up its hands on more than one occasion. So we look forward to seeing this in committee. We've agreed that the principle is right. The details in the bill need a lot of work. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.